This is WPSL Port St. Lucie, the talk of the Treasure Coast.
It's 11:07 at WPSL 1590. Talk of the Treasure Coast. You're on Ask a Rabbi.
And this is Rabbi Shafir Lobb for Congregation Eitz Chayim, your Jewish home on the Treasure Coast. Warm day out there. It's supposed to be one of our warmest days. Wishing everybody a happy Friday, a happy day in summer.
Stay hydrated.
Please do stay hydrated. Stay hydrated. Find some airflow. Find some good times and places. So sitting here on my desk is this talk about Roe v. Wade. The news and all that. And so I'm going to take a little bit of a left turn on that. And that's not meant politically left. Maybe it's an odd turn, a perpendicular turn. I don't know that I'm going to label right or left. But I will mention that is about the gender inequality in United States culture predominantly. It's not as echoed in other parts of the world. And as I mentioned before we went online, the part that bothers me about that is the amount of women's care that comes out of these centers. It's not just about abortion, folks. It's about prenatal care. It's about Planned Parenthood is about intending to have your children, taking care of them, being prepared for the advent of children, and all of that. A lot of prenatal care, and that's where a lot of damage is done to the fetuses, is in the early part of pregnancy. There's something called teratogens, and there are far too many people who engage in teratogens, who are exposed to teratogens. What's a teratogen? A teratogen is a chemical that is normally outside the body, that comes into the body, that has a harmful effect on the fetus. So it can affect...
I've never even heard of that.
And a lot of people don't. Well, you have heard about it. It's things like not only liquor and drugs and smoking and things like that, but just environmental stuff. All different. Thalidomide was a teratogen.
Oh. Okay,
so anything that potentially damages the development of the fetus. Okay, and so...
I hate to say it, but, like the vaccines and stuff, and now the little kids, somehow that thalidomide thing just comes into my back of my brain.
And the problem with thalidomide was that... Oh, that's what I'm not hearing. Hello. One of those days, yeah. Okay, so I'm not hearing this the normal way, and now I realize why. It's because I didn't have my ears on. Yeah. So the teratogens, there are many, many in our environment. Carbon monoxide can be one. Even just stress on the woman can have profound effects on the development of the fetus, on what genes are activated and what genes are put to sleep, if you will. So there's a whole lot of that, and there's a really couple of very interesting things about that. We may or may not get there, but that to me is the saddest part about Roe v. Wade and what's happening, is that it's going to put a lot of women's health into a financially unstable position.
And what CBS, our newscast top of the hour, just mentioned, that apparently 75% of the people that are getting abortions are either black or brown. It's a pretty staggering number.
Because otherwise they can't get the proper health care, and so they're opting for that choice. There's a real easy solution to abortion, folks. Require the father to pay for the 18 years of bringing up that child.
Yes.
Because I was actually thinking about that as I was walking up. There are very few women who hold a gun to a man's head and say, "Inseminate me or I'll kill you."
Yeah.
Okay, I mean, it doesn't happen.
Yeah.
Right? And so the father, we can presume, in most cases, is probably a willing participant in the process. And today we have the wherewithal and the knowledge to know who that father is, with at least a reasonable amount of certainty. And DNA, and if you've engaged in the act, folks, it shouldn't just be the woman who pays the price. But that is the gender inequality in our society, that women alone pay the price. And, and now, as I've said on other shows, right, vaginas are more regulated than weapons in this country.
And that view goes back decades.
Oh, yeah. It's interesting, because the other thing that I was planning on talking about today is wedding customs, because I get a charge out of that. There's a significant number of differences between a Jewish wedding and a non-Jewish wedding. There's certain things that happen in a Jewish wedding, and we're getting what I would refer to as cultural backwash from. Yeah, it's kind of interesting. For example, white wedding dresses. White wedding dresses are actually fairly new.
Huh?
You can thank Queen Victoria for that. She wanted to wear white. Prior to that, they were typically red or blue or some other lovely color. The purpose of the wedding gown is to show the wealth of the bride's family. And in the days before Maytag and Whirlpool and all of those good folk.
There was a day?
There was a day. There was a time when people washed clothes by hand, and keeping something bright white was just not easy.
Before Tide?
Before Tide. Yes, before Tide, never mind. When the waters were safer.
Yes.
Right. And so the idea of being dressed in white was extremely ostentatious, because there was nothing else you could do with the fabric after the wedding. So it was a one-time wear garment. And regardless of cultures, seems to have a lot more to do with the wealth of the bride's family than anything else.
Well, you look at like some of these monster
Gowns.
Indian weddings, and oh my gosh, the colors.
Yeah.
They are awesome. They are really
very,
awesome.
very bright colors.
Oh, yeah.
In other cultures. And so that white is a backwash, if you will.
That's interesting.
Coming from her. Because everybody told her it was a bad idea. It wasn't nice. It was far too flashy, far too ostentatious. But after she did it, it was like, oh, man, that's kind of cool. So people started imitating it. And that's when white wedding dresses came into fashion, and the big flowy gowns and the trains that you can't possibly do anything with. And what do you do with the wedding dress after the wedding? And they're horribly expensive. So yeah.
And meanwhile, the guys just go and rent a tux.
Yeah. And if you're lucky, he gets a cummerbund or a tie that matches the bride's colors. Right?
Wearing athletic socks with your tux.
Whatever, one of the first weddings that I did as a rabbi, everybody was dressed in flip-flops. Everything else was formal, but the shoes were flip-flops. And it wasn't in Arizona; it was in Ohio.
Was it like on a lake or something like that? No.
Nope. It was just what the bridal party wanted to do to
Okay.
make their difference marked.
There you go.
Right,
Well,
'cause-
hey, more power to them. Yeah.
So here's some other wedding customs that people may not be aware of. That one of the reasons for bridesmaids was because if the bride, remember that not too long ago, most marriages, if not all, were in fact arranged. They were economic units devised by the parents to continue the power, the class, the whatever.
Not
of
in
the
this
family.
country, though.
Yeah, even in this country. It's industrialization that changed it.
Wow.
Industrialization increased the habitation in cities and increased the ability of people to get to know each other. So that allowed for proximity romance that wasn't part of a rural farming society. There just weren't as many ways and places for people to get to know each other.
Sure.
And so arranged marriages were much more common, and they were made typically between people of the same socioeconomic level, because that made sense. I mean, in some cultures, for parts of the Himalayas, for example, all brothers marry the same woman, and the property stays in the family.
Wait a minute, back up.
Yep. All brothers marry one woman. I don't know how many of them have relations with her to make children, because obviously that's going to be limited. But that way, the family unit continues to live on the family farm, and it stays. And the male children from that arrangement are the ones who continue. And yeah, this idea that we have in America of one man and one woman is, it's not all that. It's not uncommon. It's not common. It's an economic choice as much as anything else in a lot of ways, because it's the easiest household to maintain. But when families used to be really big, there were differences. And biblically, certainly more than one wife was allowed, but you had to be able to afford and treat them equally.
Okay.
Which, given the average American household, would not be easy.
Then there was the old Mormon thing.
Well, that's where the Mormons kind of got it, because they looked at the biblical idea and the womanizing in some of the leadership in the early Mormon church. It was a great way to couch it. And it is still, to this day, mostly the leaders that have so many wives, as opposed to just one or two or three. But that's not the mainstream Mormon. That's the split-offs, and it isn't legal. The state of Utah does not allow multiple wives. That was an agreement. That was a requirement for statehood, actually. That was part of the agreement for statehood, was that they would go to one. And at that same time, the Mormon Church did receive confirmation from God that that was the path to take. So, we need to respect different religions. There was a group of Mormons, not surprisingly, that did not want to give up their extra wives, and so they split off. And they're splinter groups, and they're called fundamentalists and some other names.
Yeah, they found groups. A bunch of them in Idaho and neighboring states.
Idaho. Yeah, surrounding Utah.
Sure. Oh yeah.
There's some in Arizona at the northern tips.
Yes.
Off the beaten paths and down in southern Utah.
By Four Corners.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That area. Some in Nevada, and Jeff's and that crew, and. They're off the beaten path, and so they don't mingle that much with other groups.
What about, we ran into it when IRSC, went to the Nationals in Kansas, and we went through some Amish communities.
Yeah.
Did they do that? They're okay.
No. It's not fair to cast an umbrella over all groups. The Amish, the Orthodox Jews, all of those that are slow to embrace technology and its advances, that pick and choose what they're going to modernize and what they're not. That's what that issue is. The Amish have limited interaction with electricity.
Yep.
That's one of their big things. So they have gas-powered refrigerators. They have horses and buggies.
Mm-hmm.
And those are lifestyle choices, and people do come and go from their community. How cultish it is, how restrictive it is, those are important questions to deal with, but on an individual case basis, not with an umbrella. And are some people more trapped in these cultures? Sure they are. But there are also people trapped in other cultures within the U.S. Stuart was talking about the Republican Party. There's traps within that culture, that group. we are a country of an interweavings of various cultures, some of which are more trapping than others. Whenever power is used, I would say inappropriately, to force somebody to stay within a group, that's when it becomes toxic. You know, that to me violates the American idea of having freedom. And we see groups that break out, and yes, there needs to be support for people who break out of closed groups. It's a hard balance between the freedom to form a closed group and the rights of the people within that group to leave it. That's the rub.
Thank you, Scientologists.
Well, you know, any of those groups, and how to beware of things that are going to turn you upside down and empty your pockets. If you're not smiling, it's not Disney. Okay? Yeah, you know.
Oh my God. Okay.
Disney is a master at turning people upside down, emptying those pockets, but they smile and they're happy and they come back.
Yeah, shakedown. Yeah.
And it is, okay? You know, and I recognized it as that when I'm there, but I still have a good time, and I, you know, pre-COVID I still went back. It's if people are getting enjoyment for it, it's not quite the same as being coerced. So there's pieces where using some logic, using some reason are really important in being aware of who and what we are. So another wedding custom, going back to that, it's bad luck for the bride to see the husband.
Oh, gosh, yes.
Right?
Yeah.
You want to talk about superstition. That one's over the top. And that comes also from arranged marriages, where if he saw her and didn't like her, he would call off the wedding. So brides, do you think you're so ugly that on the day of your wedding, that's the bad luck, that he's going to reject what you, that's also the reason for the veil.
Wear a 3-layered veil.
Yeah, so that he can't see what he's getting in the arranged marriage.
I think that whole thing is stupid.
Well, you know, but it persists because as people no longer have quite the same reasons, you know, I'm thinking back to my father's youngest brother, whose wedding I actually attended, because when you have 20-some kids, the ages kind of span the generations.
Yeah, I guess.
And since my father was one of the older kids in the family, by the time his youngest brother came in, he was significantly younger. And so I went to that wedding. Now, that was an interesting wedding because it was in the Orthodox Hasidic community in New York.
Oh, okay.
And they did marry for love. It was not an arranged marriage, but they pretended that it was. Okay, so they went through the pieces of doing it. And we'll talk in a little bit more about how arranged marriages are arranged today as a way of trying to bring in some compatibility issues, because not being compatible is definitely a bad way to go into marriage.
But do they know each other?
They don't really know each other even today. Okay, so I'm going to flip and talk about that, and then I'll go back to my uncle. But the way that marriages are arranged today is there is somebody, if somebody wants to get to know somebody, or if they're just their marriage age and they're looking to get married, that's a normal part of life, there are people who arrange it and who attempt to balance wealth of the family, all the different factors that go in. Wealth is just a small part of it. You know, does this one want a scholar? Does that one want a businessman? Who, what, when? You know, what is each family willing and able to support and do?
The old, you better be a doctor?
Well, no, actually in the Orthodox community, the most valued are usually Torah scholars who get paid by the community to study Torah. But unless you get one of the well-paying positions, it's not a wealthy position. So there's a whole lot to the economics that I can't even begin to cover in one.
Wow, I've never heard of that. I mean,
Oh yeah, there are people who are paid to pray, paid to study Torah. Those are legitimate professions, and they're supported by the community. So it's, it's not in some ways all that different from we pay people to do research. They're researching Scripture.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So, there's some.
But you kind of expect that at a university level or something.
Well, and this is done under a school context. They're attached to a school.
Oh, okay.
They study and they teach. So, it's not all that different from a university kind of setting, but it's not. It's similar and different. And so those are some of the considerations. And then what they'll do is the couple will meet for, say, a glass of tea or something like that in a very public place. And they'll have 2 or 3 or maybe 4 meetings and decide if they're compatible or not. So it's not anywhere near the kind of dating thing that we go through in quote-unquote American culture. But it's a subset of it. And the couple will, and they'll discuss things like how religious are you? How important is it to follow these rituals, that ritual? They'll discuss somewhat unemotionally the scaffolding of the marriage. And if they're compatible at that, then they hope that the rest there'll be enough bridges in there to build a working family. How many kids do you want? Those kinds of things. Should the wife just be a homemaker? Those are the kinds of questions that they're going to discuss.
Well, and I would think nowadays all that's out the window, right?
What?
As far as the days of being a homemaker, that's kind of 50-ish.
Not if you've got 7, 8, 9, 10 kids.
Oh, well, that's, yeah.
Okay. And some of the men in this community are in fact very wealthy. Sometimes the woman also works. It varies. Those are the kinds of negotiations and discussions that they have. So, yeah, it has changed. There are more women working outside the home now than there used to be. And sometimes the woman will, so often there's a business associated in the families. And, depending on how, what, where is all of the discussions. And again, marriage was much more important and probably still is among the wealthiest. Like those of us who can't afford big fancy weddings don't have them.
So how do they look at just like living together then?
That doesn't tend to happen anywhere near as much. It might be a very quiet, private wedding if you're not wealthy. And then, there's always been a chunk of any population that doesn't marry for a number of reasons. Orientation might be one of them. Not everybody's attracted to somebody of the opposite sex. And to the folks who think that that's a choice, no, that's something that in many ways is turned on during the pregnancy. If the mother is unduly stressed, the odds of the child being gay or lesbian increase significantly. It seems as if that's a family thing. If the mom is so stressed, it's as if her body turns on the marker inside the child to be a supporting member of the family as much as an extender of the family.
Ooh.
Okay.
Wow.
So it's and here's the other piece. The more children a woman has, the more likely the next one in line will be gay or lesbian. It's as if, you get so many stops in the womb and then Boom. So it's always been, and probably always will be, about 10 to 15% of the population have same-sex orientation. Orientation is what gets the hormones in your body to do their thing.
It's funny, the fellow that I worked with at the Dodgers, broadcaster, his family has 4 sets of twins.
Wow. So, yeah.
He had 3, and then his son, who's a doctor in L.A., wound up having twins. And I'm thinking,
so
I have never heard of that before.
The tendency toward twins is, in fact, genetic. It's one of the things. We're learning a lot about the genetics.
It's fascinating.
It is very fascinating.
But, you have some ethicists saying it's dangerous.
Well, because we might pick and choose, we might arrange, we might design our children.
Design our children, yes.
As we become better at that. But we've always done that.
Germans did it, or tried.
Well, I'm not talking about horrific involuntary. Right. So the key there is how much choice somebody has on something, and whether or not somebody goes off the wall weird on what they do or don't like. But, there's always going to be the other component, along with whether or not certain genes are there, is what, in 9 months of being in the mother's womb, what else gets turned on and turned off. It's not just what genes you have, but what are the markers that get applied in the womb by the environment around the fetus. So there's many questions in the process. Would that we could get rid of certain defects. That I can see a great value in that. The other reality is that genetics, life itself, self-selects against genetics that are not that do not contribute to the survivability of the species. And that's a clue that same-sex orientation, in fact, is important for the society. We need the nurturing people that have what the Native Americans call two-spirit. Right? The ability to see things differently, out of the box, to bridge the genders and things like that. We do a lot of things to men and women in this country that are not natural, that are not, that are involved in putting women down, and there's just a ton of them, and they're not, the not working outside the home, right, keeping the woman captive in the home, right, not independent, so that she can't go out on her own if he's not a good father. That's a horrible societal prejudice against women, to keep them as victims. And a lot of women may not view it that way. That doesn't mean it's not true. Sorry, folks. The whole idea of women wearing so much cosmetics because a man, here's the piece, right? Doesn't matter what a man looks like, it matters what the eye candy on his arm looks like. Right?
How's your Rolex? Oh.
Well, not the Rolex, yeah, the other eye candy. And we see that played out. Right? We see a lot of eye candy on tall men's arms, because we still do judge by height. Very tall men are a small subset of the population, but they're a disproportionate percentage of CEOs, because there's a physical aspect of being tall that makes you appear to be a commander.
So how did Elon Musk make it?
There are always exceptions. But let's look back even into the Bible. One of the great features of Saul, the first king of Israel, was that he stood head and shoulders above the rest.
Really?
Yeah, it says that in Scripture. He stood head and shoulders above the rest. So we know that he was tall, and we know that David was tall, because when he goes to fight Goliath, Saul says, "I'll give you my armor." And David says, "I don't like it because I feel encumbered by it." Not because it doesn't fit, but because I'm not used to moving in armor. because it's restrictive. And he wants to fling his arm, and if you don't have full movement of your arm, you can't do that. So that's why he rejects it. You have to read Scripture carefully. But if Saul, who's head and shoulders above the rest, gives David his armor, that means David must be head and shoulders above the rest. And so he's this commanding figure. We also get from the book of Ruth that he probably, well, we know he was ruddy because it says that he was reddish. He probably looked pretty much like a Moabite. That's the whole purpose of Ruth. It's to show how a Moabite could become an Israelite. Huh? What? Who? Yeah. When Ruth marries Boaz and has a child, that is not her child. That is not Boaz's child. That is Naomi's child. If you read when Naomi...
Wait a minute, back up.
It's Levirate marriage. Yibum, it's called in Hebrew. Levirate marriage. Because Naomi's husband and 2 sons died, there's no one to carry on her lineage. And so, her daughter-in-law marrying her cousin Boaz, the first child of their marriage is rightfully Naomi's and is technically adopted, and thereby becomes Israelite instead of Moabite.
Wow.
Yeah. And that's, you can pick that up if you read it, and it's in the very last chapter of the book of Ruth, where Naomi holds the child up, and everybody says, who would have thought that Naomi would be able to have a child at this age? It's not about Ruth, it's about Naomi. That it's called Ruth is because Ruth is the one who facilitates the Yibum, the Levirate marriage, back to Naomi. And so...
she was like a surrogate.
She was a surrogate in those days. Surrogate both male and female so that Naomi would have a child.
Wow. That's
Yeah.
a wild story.
It is a wild story, and that's why it's in the book of stories.
Sure, naturally.
Because it probably was written after the fact of David, but to explain why somebody who looked like that could become king. And I'm sure there was a lot more mixing and things like that going on that below the radar. But there's a clue. There's enough clues in there that he didn't look like the average Benjamite. He didn't look like the average Judah descendant. He looked a little different, and he carried himself a little differently. He was an interesting man. And many wives. Many, many wives. Far too many wives. and doesn't discipline his son for raping his daughter.
Oh, God.
Yeah, the rape of Tamar. Yeah. But there's a lot of... one of the important things in Torah and in scriptures, in Jewish scriptures, is who inherits what piece of land. That's always been important. It's one of the reasons for marriage is who inherits what, to be able to pick out the heirs. And so that's part of the reason why it's not as critical for non-wealthy people, because they don't have anything to inherit. So the marriage is not as difficult, and it's a much more private affair typically. But of course everybody wants to be rich, and so couples housebreak their families, into, and I mean by that, breaking houses, not people use up savings and go into horrible debt to finance exotic weddings that are just over the top. So yeah, that's where some of that came off. Those were shows of wealth. They are ostentatious, and many of them are.
You think 10 million is a little extravagant?
I think 10 million is just a tad on the extreme side.
Okay.
And but I'm the kind of obnoxious person who would much rather see that money go into a nonprofit to distributing food to those who are food insecure and clothing to those who are.
Oh, how
clothing.
idealistic!
I know. I'm just a liberal, whatever that way. I confess I was raised to believe there's enough on this planet that everybody could be okay, and that we can achieve better than what we are, and have some kind of a moral obligation to the Creator to do that, to improve the world. Jewishly we call that tikkun olam, repairing the world. And it's one of our key tenets, that our charge is to leave the world better than we find it. And I strive to embody that in a number of places. I'm the president of a service group, and one of the things that we do during the meeting is police the room. And by that we mean pick up pieces of paper and make sure that we leave the room cleaner than we find it.
Mm-hmm.
It's a small way of doing that, but that's an expression of the same effort, that we need to continually make the world and the processes better and healthier, safer, all of those things, because we can. And I'm always reminded of that great song, and you'll recognize it, right? We didn't light the fire.
Mm-hmm.
Right. It was burning as long as the world's been turning. And that's true. There have been and will be troubles and problems and challenges and conflicts and all of those things. And we can either choose to turn those into growth opportunities, or we can sit back and complain.
The big news story this week, that earthquake in Afghanistan, and to hear the Sky News. I love those guys in Britain, and they're so far ahead of where we are in the U.S. But anyway, they were reporting, apparently since the Taliban took over, the country has been in a deep famine, and in this area where the earthquake hit, it's like everything wrong in the world has come down in that little village. It's
and
awful.
They didn't choose to be born there. They don't choose to live there.
No, but it's so sad, so sad. And of course now the Taliban's asking for the international community that they kicked out,
right, to come back in and
back and help. It's like, oh brother,
be careful. Make your words sweet, because you never know when you have to eat them.
Yes, gosh, that's true.
And myself included in that. There are times that, I have to mend bridges that I thought I didn't have to, and it's better to not have burned them totally to the ground.
Or dynamite them.
Yeah, dynamiting them is not a really helpful way to ever be able to rebuild them. And, and I look at places like Ukraine right now.
Oh.
And, there's certainly enough places in the world that we are not doing a great job as a species in taking care of each other. We're just not.
Well, and like the Russians, who are not permitting all that grain, which was going to go to Africa, out of Ukraine.
Yeah.
And it's like, what? So now apparently the UN is... I don't know why the UN hasn't been involved in this whole thing in the first place. But anyway, now they're going to ferry some of this grain down to Africa.
Yeah. There are so many ways that we could be a much better planet. But we've got people who are involved in personal disputes, for lack of a better way. Right, this is a personal thing to Putin. It's not a national thing. It's a personal thing.
Yeah.
And, we can see that at all levels of politics, of business. When things get personal, they go off the rails. They get weird. And I can see that within companies. I can see that in cities. I can see it in states, countries. It's all over. When things get, where egos get hooked and power struggles become personal, things go off the rails. And it's just the way it is. And it's kind of like the question of, where are the adults in this dispute? Where are the adults? Because people are not adulting. They're just not. Adults are supposed to help keep kids from getting their fights out of control. And we're just not seeing enough of that going on in the world in all of the various places that it may or may not be.
You're a professor.
I hope so, yeah.
And, I've been talking to a lot of teachers who are totally frustrated, in their PTO meetings where they might only have 2 or 3 sets of parents come in 4 hours. And what's happened to parental involvement?
We have parents that are almost afraid. Almost afraid.
Or too busy making money or attempting to make money.
Well, doing whatever
their
they're
kids.
doing. We're not doing as well as we could do with a lot of things. Okay, come on.
Now, at your level,
Mm-hmm.
obviously, the parents aren't involved at a university level. I don't think.
Not typically.
Yeah. But it really is frustrating, and you see there are certain schools where your parental involvement is off the charts. Like private schools, of course. In some of the Catholic schools, you have to be involved.
Yeah.
That's part of the deal.
It is part of the deal. And when I teach a student for a bar or bat mitzvah, I expect parental involvement.
There you go. Yeah.
Because it's a family event. It's not just a solo event. And I say that, I chuckle at the parental involvement because, of course, some of the students that we have are below 18 because they're dual enrolls, so they're still in high school. And you get more parental involvement in those cases. And sometimes you have to because the kids don't drive yet, so they've got to be dropped off and picked up. And there's a whole set of stuff that goes along with it. And that's one of the reasons why IRSC is co-locating, if you will, like the Clark Learning Center. The students can walk from the high school to the campus to take classes because that way they don't have to have rides. And those are serious concerns and issues. Yeah, and I chuckle because I was thinking back to, I don't teach religion this semester, but when I did, one of the requirements I had was that people go into a mosque, a synagogue, and a church, regardless of their faith tradition. And I had a woman call me up one day and say, my daughter cannot go into a mosque because she's Jewish. To which I responded, I'm a rabbi. And
Yeah.
I'm not asking her to pray. I'm asking her to go in as a polite observer. She's not validating. She's not honoring. She's observing.
Mm-hmm.
And all I ask of her is that she be respectful, pay attention, and answer the questions at the end of.
It's funny you say that because, that was drilled into us at Loyola University. Let's take a group over to Rabbi Magnan's temple. Let's take a group over to the imam. And of course, that led to every Friday they would come to the campus.
Yeah. Well,
I just, it's been like that for me my whole life.
Okay, so here's the bottom piece, and I know I've said this other times. And we were talking about creator gods when I walked in. If your religion posits a creator God, one God who creates one universe in which we all live, it has to be the same God, regardless of your religion.
Mm-hmm.
If it's one universe, one creator, and it doesn't matter whether you call that God Dios, Lord, God, Adonai, Allah, it doesn't matter. Supreme Being. If you believe in a creator God who has a responsibility to create the universe, it's the same God. We are not the same people, but it's the same God. And most traditions that I know of start people from one couple. Right? Jewish, Christian, and Muslim, it's Adam and Eve. So we're all related, folks. And yes, there's other folks that they marry, which is kind of interesting because that one is one of the challenges in any scripture, regardless of whose scripture you're using.
Well, then, hi, cuz.
Yeah, and we are, right? We
Yeah.
share
No, I get
most
it. I get it.
most of the genetic material that you have is identical to the genetic material I have. It's the stuff that gives us a heart, 2 arms, 2 legs, a specific number of toes, and eyebrows, and a face that sits in front of our heads. That's a ton of information, and it's what makes us different from a dog or a cat. At some point, there's a different number of chromosomes, a different shape of chromosomes, but most humans are pretty much identical. It's a small amount of material that makes for the differences, but boy, I'll tell you, the closer we are, the more we notice those differences.
It's interesting. You have, say, the Polynesian cultures, Hawaiian, Tahitian, that is like everybody's cuz. Everybody's related.
Yeah.
And you start thinking about it.
We are.
We are. Yeah.
And I don't care if you take the Adam and Eve story, or if you go and you say at some point Homo sapiens started. And this evolution thing. I don't care where you start. Somewhere it started with a couple. So yeah, we are all cousins. We're many removed, and the meiosis and mitosis that create the sperm and the egg. So let's go there. There is a process in there where the body tries out new things, and they either work or don't work. And that's why siblings don't share exactly the same genetics. There are things that we can see that are different. And that's because the genes, when they do their splitting to create the sperm and the egg, do this kind of freewheeling, well, let me trade this piece and I'll take that. And it's not always perfect. And sometimes it just mutates and changes, because why not?
I'm fascinated to see like some brothers and sisters that I know, where one could be maybe a brunette and the other be totally blonde, and you think, wow, really?
That's because blonde is recessive, and so the blonde only occurs when they get a blonde gene on both halves of their chromosomes.
Wow. Okay.
So, and we can always have discussions about how and why. There's a great Harry Belafonte song where he's talking about this woman having his baby, and so he goes to look at the baby, and the baby has blue eyes. He says, "Not mine." Right. It's yeah.
Oh boy.
So there are pieces that we recognize. There are Mendelian traits, which is the early Professor Mendel looked at fruit flies and just the different colorations, and developed a genetic system where he talked about dominants and recessives. But not everything's quite that simple and clear-cut. That eye color is one of those things that, for the most part, but not perfectly, seems to fall into that hazel eyes or a weird
That's mine.
split.
Yeah.
Hazels have an interesting sets of genes and expressions. The other thing that's like that is the white patch on a poodle's, or a solid colored breed of dog very often will have a white patch, and that's not necessarily genetic. It's genetic material. So what's genetic material?
Same thing, isn't it?
No, it's not. When we say something's genetic, we're talking about what's actually on the chromosome, on that ladder, the DNA ladder. When we say it's genetic material, that's other stuff that's inside the cell that isn't necessarily attached to a gene, but it affects the expression of the gene. And where we get into things like that are things like some cancers are triggered and some aren't. And some of that's chemicals that make their way into the cells through infiltration, and other things that are within the cell itself that causes some gene to be expressed under certain circumstances. So these things are fairly complex, and figuring out all of the if-thens. We could look at the genetic material and the expression of our bodies as a set of if-then statements that are beyond beyond the supercomputers today. of how does this get triggered. And they're trying to figure out all of the different variables that play into it, and how and what do we do. And it's not easy. It's a very complex set of processes, and some people just don't get how something can be that complex, and so they throw it out because it's more effort than they're ready to commit to.
Wow. Okay.
And and all of that plays into who and what we are, how it works, and what have you. I don't have all the answers. I have some of the good questions, and I know that we're still figuring out a lot of things. It's fascinating to watch cells separate, replicate, and do all of that. We can watch it, but we don't necessarily understand how the cell knows what to do.
Okay, as a religious,
Do
you ever have conflicts with your
Science?
scientific mind?
Not when I go into it well. So there's a Jewish thing that says the more you study nature, the more impressed you are with God. And, if I look at the flowers in my front yard,
Of which you have many
of which I
beautiful
have,
ones.
well, because I take pictures all year round and different flowers show up at different times. But if there's a flower meditation that my father taught, which is to look through the flower to its seed and recognize that its seed was produced by a flower, by a seed, by a flower, by a seed, all the way back to the Garden of Eden.
Ooh.
So not only are we all connected, but all of life is connected somewhere, sometime. And again, it doesn't matter if you take a biblical view of it or if you take a scientific. The only difference is your definition of a year or a day. And since hours weren't invented when the Bible was written, hours are a later invention, folks, and they're man-made, not God-made. And the proof of that is that it's not exactly 365 and a quarter days to go around the sun. It's not exactly 24 hours to revolve on our axis. It's somewhere between 23 hours and some minutes and 24 hours and some minutes. You can look that up. It's not a perfectly defined world.
Wow.
And so, yeah, the more we study, the more we learn, the more impressive God is.
How do we get in touch with you?
We can find me at Congregation Eitz Chayim, your Jewish home on the Treasure Coast, www.eitzchayim.org, or on Facebook you can find us as well. We've got a Facebook page, and we're going to get some other social media going here soon.
All right. Have a good week.
You too. Have a great week. God willing, see you next week.
You've been listening to Ask a Rabbi right here on WPSL, Port St. Lucie. Talk to the Treasure Coast, webcaster to the world on TuneIn.